Jaybird. People said there was at least 10 years worth of rage and humiliation in the 10 minutes it took Jaybird to beat the foreman to death. Longest 10 minutes on earth. He never let up. His hands looked like they'd been through a meat grinder by the time he was done. Halfway through, the foreman stopped asking for help and just looked stunned at how badly he was getting hit. It must have been the kind of pain that stops you dead in your tracks and keeps you from thinking, the kind of pain where you don't even have the strength to cuss. Later, we realized he'd been trying to take in a breath but couldn't. The foreman had been over everyone on a big site a year and a half back in the low country, and a lot of guys at the Cazador, no different than Jaybird, had put in time on that project. It was a big deal when the bottom dropped out. The state government got involved. Jobs and the money along with them had vanished. People got no notice. The paychecks just never came. But that wasn't what Jaybird was trying to settle with his fists that night. As far as we understood, the foreman probably got screwed like everyone else. We still don't know why the foreman, or ex-foreman we should say, came to the Cazador that night. Jeremiah went to jail. But after seeing something like that, it didn't matter. We say he came to the Cazador and not into the Cazador because he never made it inside. Jeremiah clocked him between the parking lot and the front door and ran out after him. People didn't start referring to him as Jeremiah until he'd been sent upstate. Before, we just called him Jaybird. We all drank on the weekends at this old Mexican restaurant. It was just a dive saloon in reality, but the county law prohibited selling drinks without serving food, and over time, the poorly conceived restaurant turned into one of the roughest spots along the highway. Jaybird decked him like a linebacker. The foreman was an older man, closer to his 60s, and he looked to be in pretty good shape. Jaybird wasn't even 30 yet. He didn't say anything, he didn't give a warning, and he certainly didn't give the old guy any quarter to try to defend himself, show him how tough an old-timer could be. We'd seen plenty of scraps that went the other way on the younger guys, but Jaybird just went for him like he wasn't going to get a chance ever again. He had him on the dirt, his knees pinning down his hands when he first socked him with a left hook. He seemed to let the gravity do the work as he brought down his balled fist right into the center of the old man's face. He was only using his left at first. The old man's angered voice carried through the bar. It wasn't until Jaybird started using both fists with a vicious rhythm that the man began weeping and calling for help. Instead, we all circled around the spectacle, beers in hand, transfixed. It's a dangerous place to hit someone, the face. The bones are all sharp and can cause injury, especially with bare fists. As the beating continued, he could see Jaybird's knuckles turn from pink like a rash to raw meat red once the blood started to mingle. The foreman's nose hadn't flattened completely yet, but it had definitely split. Bits of the skin over Jay's knuckles and fingers peeled away as he kept wailing on the old man. Odd thing about fights in the real world, they're pretty much silent. Unless the two parties are yelling, fists make little sound. We could all hear the muted slaps of Jay's knuckles crashing into the tanned leather hide of the old-timer's skin. Jaybird leaned in and pressed the man's head down against the earth and started taking long, heavy blows that just used the whole right side of his body against the ear. Darkness pooled beneath the old man's skin. We heard things snapping and cracking like ice being crushed in a plastic bag. The contours of his face changed. Finally, the old man was left alone on the ground, twitching as if he were having a seizure. He didn't get back up. His eyes flickered around like he'd had them fixed on some insect. He wasn't talking. He was just making dribbled noises with his mouth. Jaybird stood up with his mangled hands and through his labored exertions mumbled something about telling his mom he was sorry. He went inside to run his hands under cold water in the restroom while we stayed out and watched the foreman twitch and babble. Darnell's girl said that Jaybird turned the guy retarded. That's when we heard Jaybird's voice say, "No, I didn't. I killed him." People were offering Jaybird a gun to finish it, but he didn't want it. The law came right after that and cuffed him and took him away. The ambulance also pulled in, but it was done. By doing nothing, we had all participated in a murder. Jaybird didn't tell on anybody. There was a lot of paranoia around town, thinking he'd make a move for a reduced sentence, but the law never came for us. Things didn't move on from that night. I think that's because we never figured out what the man had done to Jeremiah. No one wanted to look into it because they were afraid of getting found out as one of the people who stood and watched him do it. But we needed to know. I think a lot about it, and I think that's why we stood and watched. We might have thought in some unconscious part of our minds that the answers would come out of the beating somehow, and we'd see why our friend, in a split second of time, threw away his life. But all we got was the ending to the story. Francisco called me around 4 a.m, which was fine because I was coming off of a Friday night of a 3-day weekend, still drunk and slouched in a booth at the after-hour spot on the hill. The Crazy Horse strip joint on Cherry Road was closed for good, along with the money and scandals and the whorehouse on Celanese. There wasn't much left to do on a Saturday morning except go home with some Pedialyte and a bag of weed and try to stave off the hangover. Cherry Road was a bad place anyway, with the college being so close and all the jailbait and violent frat house kids living near. Best to go north and keep drinking at Morgan's, where people your own age crashed at the end of the line. The phone was buzzing along the table, knocking over warm, sticky brown glass bottles. I answered the phone and told him where I was. He said he was coming down the road and wanted to go to the Catawba reservation to pick up some dope. So he picked me up and we drove out to the sticks and knocked on the Boiler Brothers' door and scored some red phosphorus crank and took it out to the lake to slam it. We were practicing karate in the dark, whacked out of our minds when Francisco mentioned Jeremiah again. I hadn't known Francisco back in those days. I didn't know he'd been in South Carolina that long. The Texan started going on about how he worked with Jaybird on the Santee Cooper nuclear project years ago. "You knew the foreman whose ass he beat?" "Yeah, he was all over us, day guys." "What was he like?" "He was a son of a bitch." "Bad to Jaybird?" "Oh yeah, real bad. I'd call him a sadist to tell you the truth." "Like what'd he do to him?" "Just like stuff. You know how it is." The sun came up and we were still wired, playing video games in Francisco's living room. We'd been talking so long we'd forgotten what we were talking about, and we had both sweat through our jeans and t-shirts. Around noon, I told him I had to get back home, and we shook hands. I crossed the railroad tracks and walked off into the daylight. On the way, I passed the Cazador. It had shut down maybe a couple of months after the beating. The parking lot had been taken over by wrinkled patterns of crabgrass and tall purple blooms of bull thistle. The tropical plants left by the last owners had all turned the same shade of brown as the fake adobe stucco. Wasps had fused their nests to the corners of the outdoor walls just beneath the gutter. The interior was covered in dirt, scraps of paper, and stale leaves. An antiquated dishwasher unit had been hauled outside to the gnarly wisteria vine, and below the kudzu-shrouded gulch lay a pit of hundreds of spent bottles. I kicked up a few wild sweet potato vines and sat on a patch of chickweed. The bald patch of dirt where the foreman lay was about 3 feet from my boots. I sat and stared for a long time. It was close to a year after the Boiler Brothers place was raided by federal agents that we started hearing rumors about Jeremiah getting out. Francisco's son claimed he saw him at the Save-A-Lot buying up eggs and cans of beans. Tommy and the boys said they knew Jeremiah was going up and down I-85 looking for work. Somebody said he was in a halfway house in Columbia. A couple of guys who ran the machine shop said they found him standing out by the York County Lowe's looking for under-the-table work with the Honduran expats. It didn't seem like he'd been in prison all that long. I was sitting with a cleaner cut group back on the hill inside the after-hours joint in December. 2 other guys in that group, excluding Francisco, had seen the beating firsthand. That's when Jaybird, looking a hell of a lot older than his days by now, walked into the bar with knee pads and tattered jeans over chalky flecks of drywall. His coat looked donated, and his hat was a shade darker on the crown of his head from the excess sweat. His hands were withered and calloused and bony. We watched him in silence as he took a seat at the booth and ordered a Dr. Pepper and vodka. No one said anything to him. He sat and drank and looked at a cell phone with his enormous hand and paid for each drink as they came. Nobody acknowledged him. Silence settled over the bar. He took a piss in the men's stall and walked outside for a cigarette. A few of us decided to go outside and smoke as well. Everyone was standing outside in the cold, half sobered up, watching Jaybird. I locked eyes with him, and instead of looking away, he gave me a nod. "Hey, you Jaybird?" "Who's asking?" I let him know I was Teddy's cousin from Clover. He gave me a subtle nod of recognition. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, we worked on the Hampton Inn by the airport, me, Teddy, and Russell." "Yeah," I said, holding out my hand. "Welcome home." He shook it, and we bullshitted for another few minutes. Then it got late, and he said he had to be at work in the morning, and got inside the beat-up-looking truck and drove off down the street. Before he left, though, he rolled the window down and called my name. I said, "Yeah?" He said, "Thanks." And nobody's seen him since.